Good afternoon and hello, everybody. Welcome to my house. My name is Frank Billingsley. I'm Mayor Dyer's Director of Placemaking and Competitiveness. And it's so nice to be able to connect with everyone here today. And I hope everyone is staying safe and being well. Mayor Dyer and our team at City Hall are all about building a stronger, better, and more prosperous community, and today's program fits right in to that mission. The Valencia Peace and Justice Institute has a wonderful record of inspiring and uplifting me personally, our city, our community, and it's just been a wonderful partner to everybody here in Central Florida. You know, here in Orlando and in Central Florida, we've overcome challenges before, and I know that together we're all going to rise to the occasion, and once again, we will be wonderful. Thank you for helping us rise, because we will rise as a community. Now, today, I'm excited to introduce our two keynote speakers for the afternoon session. The first is Dr. Ellis. Dr. Wendy Ellis is the founding director of the Center for Community Resilience at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ellis has spent the last decade developing and working to grow a resilience movement, we like movements, to address systemic inequities that contribute to social and health disparities that are often transmitted in families and communities from one generation to another. This initiative and networks are implementing a strategic approach to cross-sector partners to bring them together to align resources, programs, and initiatives with community-based efforts to address adverse childhood experiences and adverse community environments. Or, as Dr. Ellis has coined them, the pair of ACEs. So let's go over that, ACE, the pair of ACEs, to address adverse childhood experiences and to address adverse community environments. This approach is aimed at building the infrastructure to promote resilience in communities by improving access to supports and buffers that help individuals bounce back and communities thrive, things that we want to do here in Orlando. This process is being used in 10 regions throughout the country, and just to name a few, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Baltimore, Seattle, and Louisville. Just last year, Dr. Ellis also launched the Resilience Catalyst in Public Health, using a novel framework that leverages local public health departments as chief health strategist in the resilience movement. She's been published in numerous journals and publications, and in 2018, Dr. Ellis was selected as an Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow to support her leadership in developing cross-sector strategies to address childhood trauma, foster equity, and build community resilience. We are lucky to have her here today. Also, I'd like to introduce Harrison Newton, MPH. He is the Deputy Director for the Center for Community Resilience at the prestigious George Washington University. Harrison works hand in hand with Dr. Ellis and coordinates work with many governments, agencies, associations, and foundations. Now, Mr. Newton has a very impressive resume and has served in many roles, such as the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer in the nation's capital, which culminated in the first resilience strategy for Washington, D.C. He also has served as the Associate Director of the Energy Division within the Department of Energy and Environment, and he also was the Chief of the agency's Environmental Health Branch. He's also served as a leader in Washington with a coalition of nonprofits in the community, playing a key leadership role in the development and passage of several district laws governing lead poisoning prevention and housing conditions, and worked on projects increasing the capacity for healthcare clinics to respond to disasters. Thank you, Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton, for joining us today and for enriching our lives and those in our community. We are collectively here offering you both a warm welcome to Orlando and a virtual hug. So let's turn it over to them, and thank you for being with us here in Orlando.
Thank you, Frank. It's Rachel. I just have a quick announcement. It's great to see you today, Frank. Thanks for that awesome introduction of our guests. So Dr. Ellis wants you to know that you were sent two attachments, PDFs, in the email that you got this morning. One is the BCR Community Strategic Planning Worksheet, and the other is the Miami Orange Duval infographic. So she's going to reference those during her talk. And I just want to make sure that you have the opportunity to pull up that email from early this morning and that those PDFs are there. Okay, thank you. Welcome, Dr. Ellis.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to be practicing a bit of resilience here in real time because a thunderstorm is moving through DC here. So fingers crossed, hopefully the weather will not knock out my power here, although it takes a lot. So I want to just tell you I'm super excited for Harrison and I to be sharing our work with you today, which I think is absolutely in line with what you heard your mayor talk about with regard to building a resilient Orlando, Orange County. But I also think this concept that the mayor shared around not only helping individuals bounce back, but also thinking about how they can thrive. And that is at the center of our work because as we'll talk a little bit about understanding the roots of inequity, is that really if we understand that many of our communities are not starting from a fair place, that we want to do much more than just help them move back to a place or bounce back to a place of inequity. We actually want to be thinking about what are those supports and buffers that are necessary to help them move forward. And so that is really what we're talking about when we talk about community resilience. So my half of the talk is really going to give you that grounding to understand those roots of inequity. So as we're thinking about building coalitions, building an advocacy platform, we know precisely those levers, those policies that drive the inequity and adversity and trauma that we see in our community, and precisely what we want to do about moving forward and how we'll move forward. So one of those worksheets that I did share with you in the email this morning, we're going to actually start working with those and maybe start a little bit of a discussion so you can begin to think about what would be the next step. And then I'll hand it off to Harrison, who will really help us to think much more strategically about what is the problem that we're trying to solve right now in the age of COVID that intersects with so many of these underlying inequities that we had prior to this pandemic. So with that said, let's get started. So as you heard Frank describe, we are a national movement. It has been really a goal of mine for the last 20 years is to really help to spark this movement of thinking about, yes, adverse childhood experiences, but really how can we focus on those contextual matters, the structures that drive those inequities that we see and those adversities that we see in community. So as you can see by this map here, we have a number of different national partners across all regions of the country. You notice there's some red states involved there, some blue states involved there, rural communities versus urban communities. And what this really should help you to understand is not only where we are, but look at the diversity in the partners there, from city government to county government to state government partners to tribal members to thinking about public health as a partner, as well as those community partners. This is truly working across multiple sectors, working across multiple populations to really begin to understand what are those drivers of adversity. And I want to take a moment for you to think about not only the diversity of the partners and the regions that we're in, but also giving you an idea of like how do they bring organizations and build this coalition for change. So the target areas that our communities look at go so beyond just thinking about childhood adversity. They include things like suicide, opioid misuse, foster care, early childhood education, child support, human trafficking, community policing, child poverty, TANF issues, immigration issues, even indigenous birth justice and eviction notices. Why is there such a wide range in thinking about what drives adversity? And again, what does this have to do with ACEs? Is that we know that when we think about solving the stressors that come under, that congregate under one roof, that congregate or become concentrated in any one community, that oftentimes these issues are really at the heart of the issue of what's driving community level traumas. And until we think about that ecosystem and begin to solve those issues that are happening writ large in the community, we can't hope to truly help our communities heal and move forward. So just a little bit about the the Center for Community Resilience. We started 5 years ago with the Building Community Resilience National Networks and local regional coalitions. Those were 5 coalitions that really started in child health systems, and as you can see, that's expanded to include the resilience catalysts, which were 5 other of those markets that were on that map. And so that's our effort to put local public health at the center of this work. So really using this idea of chief health strategists to begin to think about how can we bring multiple sectors together and think strategically about the systems that are driving the outcomes that we see. And from this work that we've been doing for the last 5 years, we have a number of policy wins because policy has always been at the end goal for us. Not only practice change, not only program change, but also thinking about what is the long-term systems change and the policy levers that will facilitate that work. So our policy lab was launched in November and built upon a long tradition of our policy wins that we've had, and Harrison will talk a little bit about those later. But first, I want to get you oriented to what is the BCR, the Building Community Resilience process. It is 4 simple components. 4 simple components from public health. Creating shared understanding. What is the problem that we're trying to solve in our community? Not just looking at national data, but looking at the data and listening to the stories of the residents in our community to begin to understand what's driving the ACEs, the pair of ACEs. What is the narrative of our community? And more importantly, what are those factors that support resilience that we can begin to build upon? Not just looking at this from a deficit model. And so then we think about the state of readiness. Well, what are those structures, those supports that we can bring to bear? What do we have that we can build upon? Because again, we try not to start this from a deficit model, but knowing that there are plenty of resources and supports that are already built in, oftentimes we find they're not connected. And so when we begin to think through that state of readiness, inevitably, we begin to think about the other partners that can come to the table. So those cross-sector partners that can help us with resource distribution, that can help us with community and political partnerships. But most importantly, you'll see this sector here, this quadrant here around community. And one thing I want to note with looking at this process is that this is not meant to be stepwise. You'll see that there's the reciprocal arrows there in the center. And that means that we're constantly doing these things at any given time. This is a continuous improvement model. And with that community voice, it helps us to prioritize issues, but also helps to co-create solutions that actually have staying power because the community has bought into these solutions. And one of the things that is important here with regard to the shared understanding is that as we started doing our work and much more engaged in community, the narrative of structural racism and how that has driven adversity in our communities became much more prominent. And that, as a national collective, we realized that we couldn't skirt the issue. We had to be able to have these very difficult conversations in community if we were to be authentically engaged with our community. So that led us to the first challenge when we had a problem to solve was how in the world will we begin to communicate this very complex issue of adverse childhood experiences and the science behind that, as well as what we often term the social determinants of health, how they interact with one another, how you cannot separate one from the other, how oftentimes what you see in that soil there of that tree exacerbates what you may have as a personal outcome with regard to adverse childhood experiences. And so we use this tree as a means to begin to frame the conversation with potential partners to help them to understand that those leaves and the branches might be something that we might readily assess, whether that's in a classroom, a child that's withdrawn or seems to anger very easily, or a mother who seems to be withdrawn in a parent in a well check with an infant. That maybe we could understand there might be some level of emotional or sexual abuse or exposure to domestic violence or maternal depression. But what we don't understand and what we can't readily assess just by observing that individual is what are the drivers? What's in the soil? What's feeding that outcome? So perhaps the mother's depression is because she's not quite sure how she's going to afford this newborn child. She has to make really tough decisions about where is she going to be able to afford quality daycare for her child, and making those kinds of really hand-to-mouth kinds of decisions about life that obviously would stress an individual, would stress a child to be in an environment, that a household that is suffering that type of stressor, but then also in the context of the community, that perhaps with the lack of economic support or economic mobility, this is a common stressor for the community. So when you begin to think about the interplay of the leaves and the branches and the soil, you begin to understand those adverse childhood experiences are really outcomes of these systems drivers. And so that helps us to really begin to frame why we have to focus on policy and practice and not just program or reprogramming individuals and looking at this from a behavior change model. So one of the things when I first started doing this work with legislators, federal legislators, as well as local legislators, is to really help them to understand that ACEs are not something that happen to those people, to stop the othering, to help them to understand how widespread ACEs are, and to put a story behind those numbers. So really helping them to understand what it looks like to have had one or two ACEs. And most of, what I found when I first started doing this translational part of the work is that many policymakers said, no one explained poverty to me like this. I understand this when you put it to me this way, that in ways that no one had ever talked to me about understanding ACEs and who it happens to, that it happens to all of us. But one of the things that we should think about is that the outcomes are very different depending upon what are the resources, the supports and buffers that you have to rely upon, that your community has to rely upon to bounce forward. What we're seeing with COVID plays out with the national data that shows us that there is a disproportionate exposure for African Americans. And when you couple that exposure to ACEs with also a lack of supports in communities, then you do have a disproportionality of negative outcomes that community bears. And so, of course, we know the burden of chronic disease is very different from our communities of color, from our lower resource communities. And when you think about it, that makes absolute sense. It's not about that individual's deficiency. It's a deficiency in the systems and their communities to actually help, number one, protect and prevent the adversity, but number two, to actually provide the substantive supports and buffers that would help individuals bounce forward. And so when you think about how you have this conversation in Florida, one of the things that we do for all of our communities is create these data sheets. So you should have a copy of that available that you can pull up on your screen now. And what it helps our local teams and networks do is really to boil down these national data to their local narrative and talk about what do these things, how do the ACEs show up, the pair of ACEs show up in our community, and what's in the soil? What are some of those drivers in the soil? But you can also see when you begin to look at the different drivers in that soil that those also represent different sectors. So when we talk about rate of violent crime, we are also talking about public safety. When we talk about the number of children in poverty, we're not just talking about individuals in poverty, we're talking about the lack of economic development or perhaps the lack of proper education for individuals to move forward. When we talk about the unaffordable or unsafe housing, that's an opportunity to invite our housing development, our economic development partners, our business community, to help us to understand why are we lacking in one community over the other and what collectively can we do together. And so one of the things that our teams have used these data sheets to really to open up that conversation. And I would say that these data sheets and these numbers could help you really when you think about just looking at making that case for support in the wake of COVID. So thinking about household mental illness, this is what your burden looked like across those 3 counties prior to COVID. But we know when you're talking about the massive loss of jobs and the complete shutdown of really what has been our social support, then we can understand that perhaps those numbers are going to be exacerbated by these larger contextual things. Domestic violence, we've seen that across the country, that many of our partners are reporting an uptick in domestic violence calls. And obviously substance abuse and misuse with regard to the adverse environment. So those sheets help us to begin to think about what does the new normal look like and what are some of those issues that we really should be focused on, both COVID response, but they were already issues for us prior to COVID. So when you look at just the things that I have starred here really point to the massive economic hit that Florida has taken with regard to COVID-19 and how that then has these rolling effects educationally and then as well as on health and well-being. But simple graphics like these help us to begin to outline what are the stories and give us the endpoints to begin to discuss how we could move forward. And Harrison will talk a little bit about that in a bit. So you saw the original pair of ACEs tree. This is our newest tool that we've developed to help really our communities respond to precisely what are those pressure points that COVID has exacerbated in our communities. So we've done a take on the pair of ACEs, and we call the adverse childhood experiences have now become adverse community experiences, and helps us to begin to think about the data, the local data, that could help fill out this story. And then the adverse community environments are just showing where we already have those systemic inequities that are only now being exacerbated and how they express themselves in the presence of the COVID or the pandemic response. So that gets us to inequity. What's equity got to do with it? So one of the things that I think has been most difficult for us as Americans to have a real thoughtful conversation around race, racism, and equity. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the important lessons that we learned in the Building Community Resilience work is that if we were going to authentically engage our communities, then we had to be willing to have those difficult conversations, to hold that space, to be able to have a full understanding of what are the drivers of inequity. Because oftentimes that can be brushed away. They say, well, slavery was 400 years ago. Yes, this is true. But systemic and systematic structural racism occurs every day, and it's baked into the system. And so it's so important for us to understand those specific policy drivers that aren't taught to us in any level of school. There isn't a graduate course even that goes through the policy timeline that I'm going to share with you. So part of my research was really helping our communities have these substantive conversations around the policies and around the systems and the decisions that have been made systematically in our social and criminal policies that drive the outcomes and reinforce the outcomes that we see. So I will just start with in the middle of that timeline because we don't have time to go through 400 years of U.S. history, as compelling as that might be. So I'll start with redlining and the New Deal, because this actually oftentimes is the easiest way to help people understand how we wound up with the types of communities that we have, the patterns of racial and economic segregation that were absolutely by design. And so if oftentimes many individuals aren't even familiar with this practice of redlining that was baked into the New Deal housing initiative, that basically when the federal government decided that they were going to get into the mortgage business and back federally guaranteeing mortgage loans, there was with a caveat that they would only back those loans that were in white-only neighborhoods, that if they were in mixed-race neighborhoods, and they certainly were not going to back the loans of families of color, then you began to not only have segregated neighborhoods, but you also, this was the beginnings of the racial wealth gap that we see in our country. So when you understand that, one, you have not only geographic patterns of racial segregation and geographic patterns of economic depravity, that they are they were absolutely by design because that housing market drives all of the other public investments that we have in our systems. So I use this oftentimes to help help our audiences begin to understand the economic underpinnings that are associated with the educational investments that we make in our communities that are also associated then with the differential community policing practices that we have based on the levels of segregation as well as of income. So this was the latest tool, and I'm just going to hold this up if you're looking on camera. This is the Fostering Equity tool that we just published. It is freely downloadable on our website, but it has a lot of information there around not only that policy timeline, but what we've learned about having these equity conversations in community and how they really help to not only create a shared understanding with regard to the drivers of inequity in in community, but they also help to really forge very substantive relationships with our community members and really help to help us to be precise with regard to the policy drivers that are driving inequity in our communities. So I encourage you to download the guide. There's also a webinar that we recorded that we put on our website that walks you through the different tools. And Harrison will talk a little bit more about the equity and policy piece in his piece. So just to kind of give you a primer of what this tool can help you to do is that we break it down by looking at three main sectors first. And that's really based on the social determinant literature that helps us to understand that the systems that really inform or influence the social determinants that we see in our communities are housing, education, and criminal justice. And so helping our advocates understand the interrelationship between these things and not only how the policy, so you'll see here, this is one of the infographics that is part of this module. It helps you to see the federal policies, how that set into place spatial patterns of segregation, but then how that racial and ethnic exclusion also informs the racial wealth gap. That burden of inequity is also associated with the different health outcomes that we see, the different social outcomes that we see. And we can certainly see that come to play with regard to the COVID-19 disproportionate impact on communities of color, as well as on those communities with lower wealth. So when we look at those three, these infographics that we created and the templates that you can actually begin to drop in your local data help you to make that case with regard to what does inequity look like across these three systems and helping to bring these three systems to the table because how they are specifically associated with the outcomes that we know are indicators for health and well-being and also indicators of equity. So one of the things that I want to also bring to your attention, it's not enough to know about the policies that drive. It's also important to be in a position where you're beginning to frame the narrative. And so we know that oftentimes communities of color, those of lower economic attainment levels, lower education levels, oftentimes the mirror gets turned on them. And it's all about what is the deficiency of that community? What did they do wrong? Personal responsibility as opposed to what could the system have done better to support those individuals. And already in the COVID-19 response, we've begun to see that. In fact, when our Surgeon General, when the nation's Surgeon General last week spoke from the White House presser and began to encourage communities of color to not drink alcohol, to not take drugs, do it for your abuela or do it for your big mama. Not only was it extremely patronizing, but it was that simple, that was that switch to there's something wrong with those people. They're not doing something right, and that's why there's a disproportionate impact on their communities, as opposed to recognizing the pre-existing conditions that make them more susceptible to COVID, and the fact that there's the preponderance of pre-existing conditions like the chronic diseases that are also associated with ACEs as well as the stressors that drive those outcomes. And so you already saw this shifting that one, instead of taking the responsibility from a systems perspective, that we were going to change that narrative from the White House to one of personal responsibility, where just 1 week prior, when we were looking at the rising death rates of COVID, it was all about we have to get more testing. We need more PPE. But as soon as the numbers started showing that there was a disproportionate impact on color, on communities of color, the narrative shifted. And we've seen this over and over again. If you want to compare the difference in our country's response with regard to the opioid epidemic versus the crack cocaine epidemic. And that we go into that a little bit more even in the equity guide. But it's important for us to stay ahead of this framing, to be able to call it out for what it is and not let that take over the larger narrative around systems change and policy change that is necessary. So when we look at the impact of systemic inequity, I don't think that I have to really spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure you've already had these discussions. But when we, one of the ironies that I find is that what we deem as essential workers are really, I think, a euphemism for those that are expendable. Those who have always been left behind with regard to our systems and our policy, that our lowest paid workers are at highest risk, and these include our home and health aides, our grocery and retail workers, our EMS and paramedics, hourly workers. But these are community members that should be the core of our coalitions with regard to resilience. Because these are the advocates that will bring in that personal narrative, that humanize the data that we love so much, but that these are the constituents that our policymakers absolutely need to hear from to really motivate the policy change. And so this is, some of those variables, when you think about the narratives, when we go through the exercise a little bit later, I want you to keep in mind not only what are the outcomes, but how do we begin to catalyze a resilience movement with the very people with whom we want to effect change for. So you've seen this tree now in 2 different iterations, but I want you to ponder on this. I want to take a few moments here for us to have a moment of discussion before I pass it over to Harrison to think about if you were to build a coalition, if you were to take some of these key issues that you see in your community, whether it's on the branches or the leaves, or whether it's in the soil, how would you go about doing that? So the second sheet that you have is our Pair of Aces strategic planning tree. And so this is one side shows the Pair of Aces, and we use this in coalition building to think about, let's give you your blank tree and your blank soil, and start to describe what's the problem that you're trying to solve in your community. What are the changes that need to be made, whether that's at the program level, the practice level, policy level? What will success look like? Because it's not enough to write a story about that. We have to also think about what are those hard and fast measures? How will we know that we're moving in the right direction? And then when you get to the strategic planning piece of this, that's the coalition piece of it. Like, what are the strengths that we can draw upon? What assets are in place? Those assets should be very much at the table and helping to drive this work. And thinking about when you set that table for a coalition, who should be at that table? And what policies can better support the community? So that latter piece, I'll let Harrison go into it, but I do want to give you a couple of minutes to take this all in and perhaps have a quick discussion with regard to thinking about how you would even begin to describe the problem that you're trying to solve with regard to building resilience, and whether it's Orange County, whether it's Duval, or whether it's across the state of Florida. So do you want to use the chat box for this function? What am I supposed to do?
Hold on. Okay, I'm here, Wendy. Okay, good. So hello. We do have some questions rolling in, okay? This one, I don't know if this is going to help you in relation to what you just asked us to do. They are asking if there was one policy, if implemented, that would bring about equity to impact the double aces, what would that policy be?
I really wish that I could say it was one policy, but if you recall looking at that timeline, you can see that there are systematic layers of policy that cut across multiple different sectors. And so instead of thinking of, one and done, and then suddenly we have equity in this country, I would begin to think about what are the specific levers that are for change within each one of those sectors and how they interact with one another. So one of the things that you might want to think about when you isolate housing, like here in Washington, D.C., affordable housing due to gentrification is a huge issue. As individuals get pushed out, they're also getting pushed out into areas that perhaps don't offer the same level and quality of education. You begin to have this vicious cycle where not only can you not afford to live in the city, but then you may not necessarily have access to the best education. Well, if you don't have access to the best education, what's going to happen? Do you perpetuate this cycle of not being able to have higher levels of economic attainment or moving up the ladder for your family? So you cannot take these things in isolation. And this is what makes it such difficult work, is that you do have to have a much more holistic view. There is not, unfortunately, I have no pixie dust. There's not a one-size-fits-all, and we suddenly are in the land of equity.
Okay, I mean, they're at home with the forms that you have. I don't know how we're not able to really hear from them. So maybe we should continue, but I know they're thinking about it. And yeah, I think we need to continue, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. Let's see, my screen just went out. Let's just keep going. Let me see, there's one question.
You want to go ahead and take the screen? Can you take it?
I'm taking it on.
All right, teamwork.
Okay, I trust you can see my screen. Great. So I just want to begin with a true thank you to you for having us be a part of this. I benefited personally from all the music and the singing and the mindfulness. Just so important right now. Thank you for the moment to do that. Picking up the baton from Dr. Ellis, I really want to encourage you to think through these things now and later. The tree as a tool. What is in your soil is a key question, and you're going to hear some thunderstorm in my background. So apologies for that. But also, then, if you look across to the second tree, you see community resilience. You can really begin to look at the connected systems and supports in the soil, because the question about what policy would you change in order to achieve resilience or forward movement on the ACEs, you're really asking a question about how do we change the systems that bring us those inequities. And, were it a policy, were it a law or 2 or 3 laws even. But what we know is it's really a complicated interaction of policies and laws, some that you can see, some that we can see and point to in statute, some that are invisible. And exist in community. So what I want to do, oh boy, sorry, apology, I'm going to have to catch up to my next slide, so forgive me for flipping through these really fast. Okay, here we go, folks. Apologies. So I want to make the connection to policy processes and really think about tactics, because it really is directly related to that question of what do we want to do? We accept this context, we accept that this is the challenge before us, but what are we going to do about it? And our organization is very much focused on helping other organizations, coalitions, think about action. I remember when I was working for the mayor's office in Washington, D.C., I was outside a church parking lot. I was talking to a woman who is the grandmother of 6. And, she said, she was talking to me about the issues related to gentrification in her neighborhood. And she said, Harrison, the things that you're talking about, I agree with all of them. That you are talking about the experience we in this neighborhood have. However, unless you're able to translate that understanding into action, it will be too late for my family and I, because we will have already been forced out of this neighborhood. We are on the brink now. So, what I took from that is it's that call to action that we have to get it. We have to get to work, and we have to move fast, and we have to move smart. So, I often think about it as 3 big buckets. We must direct our policy efforts appropriately. We need to do a lot of deep thinking about those systems that are creating the inequities that we are concerned with, the systems that are supporting the ACEs, the experience of ACEs in our community. We must understand and address the institutional barriers. And I think that's very interesting, because we have a lot of policies. I think we could all look at policies. You could look at policies in Florida that you agree with. Somehow those policies that exist are not creating the outcomes you desire. And a lot of the times that's because of barriers that are within the institutions in which we all are living. And a new policy placed into that same framework will have a similar outcome. Sometimes it's not just the policy, it's that you have to understand the barrier, and you have to create a mechanism for undoing those barriers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And we must also account for invisible policies that often shape our practice. Again, back to that question about which policies. I think those who work in government, familiar with government, that a policy on the law, there can be situations when policy does not mean practice. And we can have practice that might not be able to point to any clear existing policy. We can have agencies, government agencies, for example, who always respond to a particular stimuli in a certain way. That may not be institutional in a law, but it is institutional in that the agency is behaving a very specific way that can be predicted. So, identifying these invisible policies is very important. And I have to say that community is where you go to do that. Community is able to tell you about its experience and its reality, the reality check on, what's in statute. There we go. So one place I often, start to try to make that connection, in talking to folks, is thinking about the role of the most important policy document that you probably have in your organization, your city, your state, wherever it is you are. And it's a place when we talk about equity, we talk about institutional racism, we look back in history. We know that a lot of what was institutionalized was done through budgets. Big, boring document, usually a lot of gray and white, pretty thick. But a lot of the things that we are looking at impacting begin or are given voice and power in our decisions about resource. Now, I know a lot of advocates actually react and kind of move back when they say that what the most important policy document is the budget. Reflexively want to move away from that. But I guess to expand the thinking, I think we all know that there are policies that if they are not funded policies, they simply don't exist as a reality in community. It's very possible for an executive to forward progressive policy, but if there's no meat on the bone, if there's no money in the pot, then it can simply be ignored. And I certainly saw that in city governance every day. So I think that rolling up of the sleeves begins with a fair look at how are we dividing up resources? Where are our values in the budget document? And if we begin to do that, I think we can also begin to think about the process of how we make those resource decisions. And I work for a mayor who I'm quite proud of, believe in a lot. Her name is Mayor Mariel Bowser in Washington, D.C. Looking at the District of Columbia budget process, just for an example, and it's a city-state process, so that it has some things in common with the city, some things in common with the way a state budget is put together. But if you look at that process, often you'll see that there is a piece of it that's set aside and marked, for the public to engage in and for advocates to engage in. And in DC, you can see this presentation here of an engagement form process by which advocates can come and make their priorities known. If we look of the process, that was in February. We were looking at those engagement forums. We can see that the actual process begins in the fall of the year prior. Way up at the top, we can see the chief financial officer playing a key role. And actually, oftentimes that September, October, November process, that's where the definitions are actually created. So by the time you're looking at December, January, February, a lot has already been baked into the cake. And while your voice is being welcome and can still have some impact, if you're really thinking about changing how things are defined, creating the new context for how things are even going to be understood and debated, framing around the pair of aces, framing around some of the institutional issues, then really that process begins much earlier. And so the reason I'm showing you this really is just to illustrate that every budget has a process, every municipality, every state. How well you know your process oftentimes is where the sleeve, rolling up the sleeves begins, because we're going to talk a little bit about strategy and the difference between an agenda and a strategy. If you're thinking about policy, you can have an agenda, you can have things you've identified, you can have identified core systems you want to impact. But then the next step is thinking about the system that you're trying to interact with. What is your theory of change about this system? If I've got this budget I'm showing you, this budget framework, what is my theory of change for how I'm going to interact with it, intersect it? Who am I trying to talk to in order to impact what? That level of technical thinking can be important. So I just wanted to talk about, the need to translate your chosen, advocacy points, your agenda points, to an understanding of the process that you're really going to engage in, and then really kind of thinking of a plan of attack. So just to go into that a bit more, when you look at that breakdown, and if you were to, you could easily look in your states, your cities, you could think about that process. You might find that there are different people, offices, and agencies involved in different parts of that process. So you may need new friends. You may need to make some new connections to be able to become active in the process in a way that you may not have had been active in it before. Whether that's the financial officer's office, a particular committee, agency staff who are informing requests. Those are all relationships you may want to build, and an understanding of which ones begins with an understanding of what process you're looking at. The question that we often encounter, that there's not enough money to support the change that you're wanting. That's oftentimes about framing, and that is a conversation that oftentimes is happening earlier in the process. There are decisions and discussions that are happening related to how government's thinking about its capital budget, how it's thinking about its operations budget, what kinds of things can be funded by each. Even that understanding can be reframed if you're in the process early enough. And these are the kinds of conversations that can shake loose thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars in a municipality. Another tactic I think that we think about and recommend is that as you're thinking about rolling up those sleeves and making change, that you look at your partner in government, the executive, and think about what strategies they've put into place. So these are just graphic depictions of strategies in Washington, D.C. You could do that. You could put this together. You could identify the 5, 6, 7 most important strategies in your city or county or state, and finding how your policy asks relate to information in these documents and other goals set in these documents is a way to find allies, is a way to make the case to the executive that the changes you're advocating are supportive of the changes he or she has been fighting for all along. But it's a terrific approach to really begin to think about, where are the priorities that we're arguing for already, put pen to paper and align with, the key decision makers that you're working with. And then, lastly, the devil in the details. A policy can achieve the opposite of what advocates intend in the budget process. And that's just to say that, before I was in government, I did a lot of advocacy. And maybe the most painful experiences were those in which you had a policy that you were forwarding, but by the time it ended up winding its way through the corridors of power, you didn't recognize it. It was underfunded. It was tied to funding stream in an agency that was hostile to it, hostile to the proposal. So they had no desire really to carry it out as envisioned. Again, maybe this is my way of saying that we really do have to pay attention to these processes. Winning the hearts and minds is important, but unfortunately, that by itself isn't always enough. So a policy strategy supports your agenda. It helps you identify the point of attack, where you're trying to intersect the process. It identifies the key timelines that you need to be thinking about, when and where the conversations are happening that you're trying to intersect. It articulates how your coalition will impact the decision-making process. It identifies the tools and products you will need to be effective. So if you know that you're trying to make friends with the chief financial officer, you're trying to have a particular outreach to a committee you haven't been involved in, you may need to repackage, reframe, and rework things that you'd already created that communicate the things that intersect the ACEs, that intersect the problems that you're concerned about. And it identifies, importantly, how you're going to expand your coalition every single year. However many people you have at the table, you always want more. And the way to do that is to be intentional and to think about where is it that you want to grow. So really quickly, I just want to tie this around to what's happening in our current moment. And these are not going to be the most visually stimulating slides you've seen all day, but they're important, I think, a little dense. So if you accept that you've got to be engaged in the policy arena and we've got to roll up our sleeves, one thing that I think you can see in the current moment is that, the policy battle is about to be engaged over, or in fact is being engaged on how the new funds related to COVID-19 will be used at your state level. There are a number of federal streams that are being enhanced with the intention that states and localities are going to be able to access new monies for work that directly relates to the pair of ACEs and supporting families and communities. The fate of what happens with this money is in the hands, oftentimes, of the state and the locality. And so we've got to get engaged in understanding where this money is coming, how it can be used, how it's envisioned it can be used. So I think most of you probably have heard about CSBG, CDBG, CCDBG, but these are major thoroughfares of federal funding that already are supporting work in Florida. You've got, I think, in St. Petersburg, I know you've got several programs I see that are the collective impact programs that are being funded through CBSGDG. You've got a couple of programs, I think, even in your panhandle, major programs throughout your state. And so making the case of what the framework is going to be in your area for how the money gets spent, what kinds of new programs are going to be raised up, is something that I think we all, wherever we are, have to begin to think about making that case and making sure we understand who are going to be the decision makers that are going to ensure that this money gets spent well. And maybe one other thing I'd mention is that a lot of these funding streams rely on the state to actually apply or become eligible for particular pots of that money. So your state has to, it's in some moments, ask or apply for eligibility for some of this money to be made available. So that's another call to action as well. So we also see these flexible funds under the CARES Act, which you've heard about in the news, I'm sure. Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds. This is money that's going, it's part of a larger education stabilization fund. There's broad discretion in how it can be used. Innovative solutions to meet learning and health and wellness needs of students. That can look like almost anything. And what it will look like in your state or municipality is going to be largely up to the policy conversation that's happening with your leadership. And then state stabilization for K through 12 as well. I'm going to speed through this. I'm sure we'll be providing all this information to you, but I just wanted to make sure that this was being tied to, our current moment was being tied to the larger need to be involved actively in policy and in making the case for funding streams that are really going to support the kind of systems change we need to see the mitigation of what we call the pair of aces. So I will, respecting our time, I think we're right at the end of our time with you. I want to turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Ellis, who will kind of close out our presentation.
That's because I was muted. There you go. You can hear me now. Just one other thing I want to add that Harrison mentioned with regard to policy is that oftentimes, yes, it doesn't look like what we pass, but sometimes even what we pass and what's funded, implementation. In the implementation, we can lose our battle. And so it's not enough to make sure that the money is put in place and that the language in the policy is as we want. We have to be ever vigilant through implementation, and then even have our hands in there with regard to evaluation of the effectiveness of policies. So it's a full-time job. So I want to also, you see here, we have listed all of our tools and resources. Again, it's all widely available to the field. And I want to give this, I guess, hand it back over to you, Rachel, for discussion and Q&A.
Okay, everybody. Thank you. So everybody, we are, as a group, really looking at how are we going to bring about some of these changes in our society and, toward resilience. So this is the moment now where we have our network, our multi-sector group, and we really are through all different areas and sectors of our community looking at building resilience and creating change. So now's the time to ask questions to Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton related to this. So if you can formulate a question and put it in the Q&A, we can get started. Will, do you have the first question to ask? Let's see, is Will there?
I am going to, we're working with technology, so they are streaming in.
Okay, I have one here. I found one. Okay, so this is about gentrification. You've talked about gentrification. And by the way, this is a doctor, local doctor, who says thank you so much for this and for the entire day. He said the template for gentrification exists nationally. We need a comprehensive approach for each community that addresses building resilience. How can we link communities of promise, and in parentheses, he said those with challenges, with similar communities which have overcome the challenges? Build bridges to success. That's his question. How do we link these communities?
Do you want to take it or do you want me to go?
You go first.
So one of the things that I think is really important is to understand what are the indicators for success. How are we going to measure success? Because what might look like success in community A may not have the same resonance in your community. So understanding if you're talking about success or what's worked, is it merely just increasing the amount of affordable housing? Is it so that you have more affordable housing, that you also have that connected to economic mobility? I think you really want to think about what success looks like first before you begin comparisons on whether or not you're working versus what some other community is working, or what may be working. The other piece of it is, as far as examples, certainly we can work with you to show some of the examples that have worked with regard to putting housing at the center of this. There were some initiatives by HUD in the early 90s with mixed-use housing, with public housing that have had some phenomenal impacts. I know Seattle, King County was a really good example of that. There was also some work in East Lake neighborhood, Atlanta, that also did that. And there's also some initiatives with regard to the San Francisco Fed Reserve, where they have initiated some community trust initiatives, one of which is in one of our communities in Rosewood, Oregon, where they've also looked at how do we stabilize housing in a community, make it affordable so that community, as the community gentrifies, it gets better for everyone, not just for those who can afford to be there.
Okay.
Did you have anything you want to add, Harrison?
I think that's great. I really do like the idea of making sure that we have communities really linking on the issue, on an issue that is often seen as solely being local. I think it's a really powerful idea. I think we could do that a lot better, a lot more than we do as advocates nationally. I think that's a really great tactic that you suggest, really.
There is a question here from Adrian Elder that I see with regard to the policy passed here in DC to have any new community development have a certain percentage of housing be affordable. Harrison, I don't know if you want to talk to that directly. I do believe that passed when you were still in city government.
Yes. So there are, and maybe I'll take a step back to think about or talk about a little bit how, I think there have been many attempts to, undo or mitigate the effects of gentrification, many different policies. And I think being honest about where we've succeeded and honestly where we have not succeeded is really important. In Washington, D.C., ensuring affordable housing or trying to ensure affordable housing has been one road that's been taken. And I think there's been some effectiveness, but there are also some real issues, right? So obviously the moment that you are trying to impact directly the pricing of property, you can run into all sorts of barriers and mal effects that can occur because of those who own those property. And one of the things I think the conversation that we had in Washington, D.C. was really talking about why have we not come to a place where the people who live in a community have ownership and stake in that community? So then as the value of that community elevates, right, that they are enriched, frankly, and are made better able to remain because the interest in their community is translating into wealth for them. And that, we can talk about, more units and this, but to me, that fundamental reality, until you get at that fundamental reality of ownership, you still probably are not going to solve the issue. We saw a lot of mom and pops driven out. We had a community where a baseball stadium and a soccer stadium were put on either end of a community that had public housing at its heart. And in fact, the construction yard to build those facilities was placed nearby the low-income neighborhood. Many of those residents have now departed. What could have changed that? What could have changed? Could we have not had a soccer stadium, not had a baseball stadium? That's one way to think about fighting this battle. Could the emergence of those stadiums enrich the neighborhood and the people that were there? That's another set of possible approaches. And, I think to be frank, looking at scanning the nation, where I see the most success are places where people are genuinely trying to deal with the issue of ownership, whether that's through land trusts or other mechanisms. I think that's where we can see a lot of answers emerging.
Awesome. I have your next question here. Seeing that COVID-19 has put a lot of us in home, and we are doing some research and we're looking at academic sources to try to navigate how we're going to bring systems back online. This question says, when was the data collected from the Building Community Resilience in Florida document? They stated that they loved this document, but they were not able to find a date.
So we use multiple data points and data sources to pull together those graphics. Some of them come from national surveys, and we have a synthetic estimation process that we use to boil it down to the county level. We also use data from all of the systems, so they're not just any one data set that they come from. One of the things that we also do when we're working with community, a lot of times these data points are stored with your local health department. In fact, your local health department typically is your best source for local data. A lot of times they do not report up to the national databases. So this is why it's important to have not only those other system partners at the table, but also the local health department at the table, because when you begin to tell the story of your adversity, whether it's the average childhood experiences or whether it's a community environment, you should be able to go to your local systems partners, because these are all performance indicators. And this is why it goes back to, this isn't about individual change and behavioral change. All of those things that we point to that's in the soil, those are performance indicators for all of our systems. So even the idea of framing them as social determinants, as if individuals have a control over these determinants, aren't fair. They're really these systems-driven community characteristics. And so going back to those systems to look at the specific outputs that inform that soil are some of the best places to. And this is why it's important to have them at the table as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So people are asking about the graphic, the COVID-19 graphic for the pair of ACEs that you shared, and if there was a way to even talk about that a little bit more. I think people want a little more of your thoughts on that.
Harrison, do you still have the screen? Do you think maybe you can pull that up so we can just have it as a point of reference to talk about or talk over?
Yes, I can do that.
While you were showing that up, there was another point I wanted to make when we were on the affordable housing piece of this. One of the things that I think we have to have a reality check with regard to dealing with gentrification, not just in DC, but across this country, is the policies that are actually, the outcomes that we're seeing today with regard to gentrification, those policies were set 10, 15 years ago. So this is why what Harrison, or the opportunities to create the climate of gentrification that we have today were really set in place 10, 15 years ago. So this is why it's so important what Harrison was talking about, like, when are you a part of this conversation? Because if now you're entering into what are we going to do about affordable housing, you're entering in the implementation phase, not when the policy was set. And so the best that we can do at this point is mitigate what's already rolling in place. So this is why, again, it's so important to be at that table, to have these conversations across these sectors, because policy that's being developed today, we may not see the outcomes for another 10 or 15 years, But you better believe if we're waiting until it's already been implemented and we're seeing the effects, it may be too late to unroll some of those things. So that's one of the important points I wanted to make, particularly with regard to gentrification, is that be cognizant of where you are in the cycle of whether it's the policy being developed, the language being developed, or if you're at the back end of it with implementation. So the COVID, and this is actually quite relevant when we talk about the COVID-19 adverse community experiences. So one of the reasons why we decided to reframe this and actually take the leaves and the branches to focus on what's happening at the community level as opposed to what's happening at the individual level is because these things actually are both. When you look at the adverse community experience, the community writ large is experiencing these things, and almost every individual within the community is experiencing one of those things. But they're being exacerbated by those things that we've been talking about that are in the soil. And so when we look at the lack of access to technology, remote work, and education opportunities, who's able to remain employed is very much dependent upon, are you in an industry that actually allows you to be able to work from home? And if you are in an industry that allows you to be able to work from home, do you have the technology and the support? Do you have the infrastructure to do that? Do you have a laptop at home? Do you have access to Wi-Fi to do that? We're also finding that that's contributing to the learning gap. And this is so important for our kids when we think about, here in DC, they've already decided they're going to end the school year early, I think about 3 weeks. This was after having almost 2 weeks of trying to figure out how we're going to do the distance learning piece of this. And we know for our children, that word gap is real. The word gap was real just over a summer break. So when you have an abbreviated school year, and when the school year kicks up, you may not necessarily have the access, the infrastructure to really participate fully in online learning, to print out worksheets. That creates an even larger gap for our kids. So it's both. That's one that's felt at a 2-generational level, whether it's with the parents or with the adults. When we think about the higher rates of risk factors of mortality due to chronic disease, think about just the idea of who can be healthy. Are you in a neighborhood where it's okay to go for a walk? We're all supposed to observe 6 feet distance between one another. That might be easier if you live near a park and you can make some distance between you and someone else that's trying to enjoy the outdoors, but it may not necessarily be as easy if you're in a very concentrated urban area where you have to make a decision between trying to keep a distance on the sidewalk or walking in the street. And so it's not as while we all are sheltering together, we're not all qualitatively sheltering in the same way. What we've also seen with regard to the lack of access to primary care and testing is, and this has been extremely evident here in Washington, D.C., when the first bits of data that began to come out to show who was getting tested. And so if you looked at just the testing numbers, it would seem to indicate that our neighborhoods, and no, it wasn't who was tested, it was the number of positive tests. It would seem to indicate that those individuals who were on the eastern part of Washington, D.C., east of the Anacostia, Ward 7 and 8, where we have the highest concentration of both poverty as well as communities of color, that there were lower rates of positive tests. So initially it would appear that, we had a lower incidence of COVID in our communities of color. But most of us in public health went, no, that's actually an indicator of who has access to primary care, because you have to have a doctor's order to get the test. And so while you saw in some of the wealthier neighborhoods, you had the higher incidence of positive tests, that really talked about who had access to a doctor who would screen them and say, here's your script, go get tested. So again, these things that have always been a burden for our communities, they play out differently, but they have absolutely the same outcome, and that's disproportionate negative outcomes for those that are under-resourced and communities of color.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question. Of the many communities that you've had the opportunity to work with, is there one or two that have developed and implement best practices for achieving community health and reducing the pair of ACEs? And where can we find those examples?
Mm-hmm. So in all of our communities, they have implemented some level of systems integration that has begun to catch some of these adversities or stressors or risk factors early, and then work across systems to identify that. In Portland, Oregon, that was the 3 to PhD program where they have co-located. Kaiser Permanente has a wellness center there. One of the organic food suppliers has a food store that's inside the school. The teachers have been trained in trauma-informed practice there, not only for their students, but for their own health and well-being. They created space for parents who live in these under-resourced neighborhoods that they could access computers at the school. So if you wanted to apply for a job or you needed to correspond and it required electronic correspondence, you could do that at the school. So the idea that the school becomes the hub of health and wellness for the entire community, and particularly for those parents, but it's not putting it on the back of the educators. The educators can still do exactly what they're supposed to do, and that's teach our children. It's bringing these other systems and integrating that care and those services in one place to be an effective hub. We similarly have seen that addressed in our partners in Cincinnati, where they have co-located not only inside the pediatric primary care practice, they've co-located parent coaches, which is a program that was instituted by some of the social service partners in Cincinnati, but they put them right there in the primary care practice. So instead of, if you have an interview with a family and you find out there's a food security issue or there's a stressor because dad just lost their job, or, there's something else that's happening in the community that's really impacting the health and well-being of that family, instead of giving them a paper referral and saying, go talk to Beach Acres, what if we co-located those partners right there and made them part of the service team? And not only that, you're doing the warm handoff in practice, but they've also worked out with leveraging their Medicaid managed care dollars. They've leveraged the way that these parent coaches are reimbursed, and they also have the ability to enter their interactions into the EHR. And why is that important? Because it's putting these social service needs at the same priority level as their medical needs. And so when you talk about the outcomes and the reduction of stressors in the families, the increase in educational outcomes for our children and their health and well-being, and that's across both of these programs, both in Portland as well as in Cincinnati. That's what resilience looks like, but that's what we're moving towards, with not just alignment and philosophy, but alignment and services, so that we're best able to address the adversity in community, prevent the long-term impacts, foster the equity. That's the basis of resilience, community resilience.
Fantastic. We have one more question, and then we have an exciting community initiative to share with you. Have you experienced a community that has successfully brought the business community together to be key leaders in these efforts?
So I don't know, Harrison, if you want to talk about Kansas City, if you want me to talk about that. I'm always running my mouth.
Well, you'll know more about that experience, I think. Okay. So I think you can do it. I'm going to follow up with comments on DC, though.
So Kansas City, our partners in Missouri they're actually co-located in St. Louis and Kansas City. But what's interesting about Kansas City is that when that city took on its Resilient KC, the Resilient KC movement, believe it or not, that was actually led by their Chamber of Commerce, not by their healthcare entity, not by behavioral health, not by educators. It was led by their business community. And how did that come to be? Is because their business leaders recognized that if Kansas City was going to be competitive with other cities across the country, they had to have a healthy workforce, they had to have a well-educated workforce, they had to have a safe community, they had to have better connected public transportation, they had to be able to connect the viable workforce to where the jobs were. And so they understood fully what were the levers that would support community resilience. And so they actually responded to an RFP from RWJ, this was about 5-6 years ago, to join this community resilience movement. And they led that. And what resulted in that is, when you get a bunch of business leaders together, you got to have a strategic plan. Of course, that's going to be like 200 pages long. It'll be thorough. But what they also had, not only was it detailed and thorough, because they were the business community, they had that influence to bring others to the table. Most importantly, city leaders, county leaders, because they could generate that political will. So when you think about not only the levers of change, but the levers of influence, this is why we have been really strongly encouraging a lot of our networks to think about how are you getting your Chamber of Commerce, how are you getting your business leaders at the table.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll just tack onto that. Implicit in your comments are that we don't assume that there are going to be opponents in any particular sector, or that we know immediately who those opponents always are going to be. And sometimes you can find allies in business. I think as you're implying, I'm thinking of a couple of anecdotes where business has landowners, property owners have been at the forefront of initiatives to improve the quality of housing, and in fact, institute policies that allowed for the more frequent and complete and thorough testing of properties and their housing conditions, not because property owners all of a sudden maybe took it into their heart to do that, but because ultimately doing that on the front end could be shown to be more cost effective than all the enforcement actions and lawsuits on the tail end. So that, in specific moments, I think there are great examples of the business community being able to be supportive and to be an ally, limited perhaps at times, but an ally nonetheless. And so it's important, I think, to always have that door open as you're forming coalition.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, and thank you, Mr. Newton, for your time and many of the concepts in which you have shared with us today. I believe you've given us quite a few things that we can take back to our local sectors, our organizations, and practice. While considering community resilience and the need for systematic change, we are happy to introduce at this time a local initiative called the K-Ready Community. As we focus on vulnerable communities in this crisis, children are among our most vulnerable. In a partnership with our sponsor, the West Orange Healthcare District, our partner, the Early Learning Coalition of Orange County, and Polis Institute, we are happy to welcome Lori Chianese to present the K-Ready Community Initiative. At this time, please welcome Lauren to the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's been, you'd think being on a conference call all day would be draining, but I have gotten so much energy from the conversation. I'm just so excited. Rachel, thank you so much for bringing us on and letting us talk. And Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton, I'm just so grateful to be able to speak after you guys, because you framed it so perfectly, and I'm really excited to work with you guys. So I don't have a ton of time, so I'm gonna kind of jump right in. Hopefully you all can see my screen. So last week, a lot of you probably know this, but last week was the Week of the Child. And I think it's telling that it kind of came and went without a lot of fanfare. And there's just so much going on, and we're all just glued to the news to find out what's going on and what are the changes and how am I gonna get unemployment? And it's just crazy. But if there's ever a time that we need to focus on our children, this is it. And so we have to make sure that we are kind of bringing ourselves back to what do we do right now in this moment to respond, but then how do we as you all said and framed so well, how do we come out of this even better and making sure that our kids are thriving? That's like one of my favorite words, to thrive, you know, because we don't want our kids just to survive or to meet a baseline. We want them to meet their greatest potential. And so I'm really excited to tell you guys about this work that we've been doing. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things. One, a little bit about the project called Becoming a K-Ready Community, which we were getting ready to launch in March, but have had to kind of pull back a little bit. So that's the second thing I'm going to tell you about, is how we've pivoted in this time with the COVID-19 crisis. And then the third thing, briefly, it's just, moving forward, how we're going to be working with Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton and the work that they've been doing on building resilient communities as we move forward with our project. So this is a model, not the model, and we're learning, and we can't wait to interact with all of you to learn with you. But what I hope is that we can be used as almost like partners and bouncing each other ideas off of each other through this time. So, this is something we've all known in this community, the community of people who are working with children, is that education and childcare are essential. It's always been essential, but it's definitely an underserved and under-resourced network. And right now, this group has really come to the forefront because childcare, especially when our schools are closed, and especially for our young children, the children under 5 that weren't in public schools anyway, has become even more essential. Because without the child care centers and providers, the folks who are essential workers are not able to work. And so these are people who are kind of keeping things running and keeping us healthy and able to get the resources we need to get through this time. And their children need to have a place that's safe, that they can go to. And so it's these providers are not just essential, but they're on the front lines, right? Because you can't virtually educate a 5-year-old or a toddler or a baby or an infant. You've got to be there with them. And so they are, risking their own health to make sure that the families who are essential workers can work. And so I think the idea is just that this is something that was essential before has just become like a whole new level of essential now. We think about this, this idea of essential, right? The firefighters and the nurses and, our emergency responders. We've always thought about them, right? But we have a new definition of essential, which is folks who are putting the groceries on the shelves and making sure that we can feed our families, and the people who are delivering, the masks that we need to go out and do our daily lives. These are people who have now become essential too. So this need for the early care and education system to be there for these people to make sure they can continue doing their jobs is even greater. And then you've got the providers themselves. And so for a lot of you know that providers in our community are mostly small businesses, that about 90% of the early care and education industry in Orange County are small business owners, mostly women. And they're now on the front lines, but they're really struggling. And that's something that we've been really thinking. So enrollment has dropped because so many families are not needing care, but at the same time, enrollment has gone up for those essential workers, right? And so there's this kind of dynamic where many providers are actually having to close their doors because they're at their center, the enrollment is not high enough for them to keep their doors open and keep paying their staff. But so where do the kids go that their parents have to work, right? There's this shuffle happening. And then you've got an issue of being able to get the equipment that you need to keep everybody safe. So providers are often on their own. They're not part of this giant school system with economies of scale. They are one woman trying to, take care of a group of 10 children. And at the end of the day, she's going to 3 stores just to get water, or she's standing in line at Costco for 3 hours to get bleach. And then she gets in and they're out. So what does she do? How does she keep her staff safe? And this is causing a lot of our providers to have to close even when there is need. So in our community, without relief, we're going to see even more providers close. The ones that are, we're funneling the children who do need care still, we're saying, okay, go to this provider, they're still open. But that provider is struggling and they might have to close their doors soon too. And we're finding that about, a lot of providers are closed, and those who aren't getting any sort of support will close forever. And so that has huge impacts on the long-term impact, right? How are we going to recover when our economy opens up again if so many of our providers have closed their doors forever? And so this issue is the early care and education system just needs our support. And so this is something that, we know if we don't address it, it's going to be felt for years. Because, the children, as we've heard from all of our presenters so far, they're so vulnerable during this time. And if we don't tackle this today, there could really be traumas that our kids experience that will be very difficult to address down the road. And so this is something that, again, I feel like I'm showing this slide and you guys are all probably saying, yeah, we know this already. Our community is, I think, particularly vulnerable because of our economy and the way that our economy is based. And we already know that so many of our families, 25%, and Dr. Ellis had shared that earlier, of our children live in poverty, but half of our families are struggling just to make ends meet. They're in this very vulnerable position of being Alice, right? The United Way, asset limited, income constrained, but employed. And so they're just right there on the brink. And then you've got a lot of other issues. Obesity has been an issue that's come to the forefront in this crisis because so many people who are obese are more vulnerable to the disease and are becoming sicker. And 40% of our children are obese in this community. And then we've got many of our kids, even before COVID-19, put us into this situation, we were struggling to make sure that kids were ready for school. 40% of our kids entering kindergarten already behind when they were 5 years old. And then you see that that issue become even greater by the time they're in third grade, when only half of them are reading on grade level. And so if we do nothing now, things are going to be even more difficult down the road. And that's why we're working to address that. And becoming a K-ready community is an effort to improve the early care and education system, both health and education, because we know a child, doesn't just appear during the school day or the care day. They are whole people with health needs, and so you have to address the whole child. But we have had to pivot. So right now what we're doing is really responding, and I'm trying to understand, what do the providers need right now to take care of their children, to educate their children, and to make sure that those essential workers have a place to take their kids during the day so they can do their jobs. And so we've been working with a group of leaders, including the Early Learning Coalition and Orange County Public Schools, and what we are calling our ECE Pandemic Response Team. And that's really just figuring out what is it that we need to do today, tomorrow, this week, and responding to the needs of those people who are on the front lines of taking care of our children. But as so many of us, have heard on the call, it's not enough to just respond to the crisis and then go back to normal, right? And a friend of ours sent us this Chinese symbol for crisis is actually a combination of the symbols for danger and opportunity, right? And so if we stop at danger, we've missed the opportunity to come out of this crisis even better, to build a more resilient community. And so that's why the next phase of this work is to just reset. How do we recover and rebuild better? Once we've gotten out of the emergency, how do we get, cleaning supplies and masks to the people who are taking care of the children? Then how can we start to get out of this crisis in a better place and position people to thrive? And then the final is to rebuild, and rebuilding and really tackling, what was it that we were doing that wasn't working before? And I think this really gets into the work that Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton do, which is, what are the policies and the systems that are fundamentally broken and have been for a very, very long time in our community that we have to tackle? They're really hard questions, but we have to address them, because if we try to build on a broken foundation, we're just going to tumble, right? And so that's the work we're super excited to be working with Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton on in the coming months. And they're going to help us figure out, how do we do that? Where do we start? There's so much that we have to do. As Dr. Ellis said, it's not just one magic policy with pixie dust, which I love because I love glitter, but that's just not the reality of it. And so we're going to be working with them to figure out where do we start and what do we prioritize when there's so much to do. So thank you.
Lauren, thank you so much. This is, we're very excited that the West Orange Healthcare District is supporting this work. The Polis Institute, which I hope many of you know about, Polis, they are doing just such phenomenal work in our community, and partnered with this K-Ready community group with Lauren and Leslie, who's not here, Leslie Hartog. There's a lot of promise here. So we just wanted to kind of ask Dr. Ellis, because this is, Lauren has kind of announced everybody, is that we are going to be partnering with Dr. Ellis and Mr. Newton to advance this work. Because one thing that our network, so we are in this cross-sector network, and you're going to meet the woman who's been leading those meetings here in a minute. And we have really decided in that group, we have talked about the fact that early learning for children, access to high quality childcare and early learning for all children in our community is a critical need. And boy, will it support women and families. And so we have met this team that is ready to move this work. So Dr. Ellis, what do you think? And if your group comes on board to help us, which you are, we're going to be continuing to work with you. How do you see this partnership going? Give us some insight here.
So I'm actually I want to put Harrison in the driver's seat on this one. I mean, we kind of split the work with, there's two halves of this, and you saw that. Even how we frame the conversation, our presentation is, first off, there's that ground building of the coalition. Who are the key members of this coalition? How are you engaged in the community? How are you engaged? And incorporating that community narrative into these policy asks, and actually using that to inform the story of adversity in your community. And then once you have that piece of it, then you can begin to hone in on specific policy opportunities. Harrison, I already saw in the questions here about, will the ECE address pay disparity for our early childhood education workers? Absolutely. It's not just increasing access to more of our kids to be in pre-K when those pre-K providers themselves are parents. And so we have to be increasing their economic mobility so that not only the education that the kids are getting in an ECE environment are great, but also when these parents go back to their homes, that they're able to provide the stability necessary for their children. So, and there's, right now there's a lot of money that has been flooded into states and locals because of the CARES Act. And so I'm going to pass it off to Harrison to talk about that piece of how we work with you, not only on the coalition building piece of it, but the policy and advocacy aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. So I'll definitely take that baton on the coalition building piece first, because I think as one of the slides kind of made clear, the process, all of the processes, the four components of the model are always ongoing. We're never done with community involvement or community input. And so, I think always finding the truest narratives, the truest stories of how these policies are impacting people in their lives, there's always more we can do, and everything always begins with listening. So I think that, piece one is to figure out if, there are people we can be in touch with, people you already know, others maybe that we want to be in contact with, to unearth the stories and narratives that relate to the policies I think that you've already begun to identify. Oh, there's a little one. I'm on the phone, honey. Thank you. I'm on the phone. I've got three little ones, three young ladies, and they have minds of their own.
All
So
real.
as I was saying. So I think it always begins with community. We would certainly focus on that piece. I think we would also want to be focusing on invisible systems and policies and levers, identifying those things that may not exist in statute, but maybe there should be a statute to impact those levers. And then I think also, the building of a strategy is always certainly something I think is of high value. Is if you have, to whatever extent you have the agenda already, it's how are we implementing this agenda? What is our theory of change that means that this agenda becomes reality, and rolling up our sleeves and figuring out who is it we want to be at the table, what is the timeline we're trying to impact, and how we tactically are going to make that change occur.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, and thank you, Mr. Newton, for your time and all of what you shared with us today. It has been impactful. I think we would all say that.